This story is titled, My Stepsister Convinced My Dying Father That I Was Stealing from Him. On his deathbed, he changed his will, giving her my inheritance. When I tried to explain, my stepmother told me to leave. I left with nothing. But months later, a safety deposit box revealed the truth. Hi everyone! Before we dive in, a quick favor. If you enjoy content like this, please hit the subscribe button. It's free, supports the channel, and makes sure you never miss out on amazing videos. Alright, let's get started. Hey, I don't even know how to start this, but I've been carrying this story for years, and I guess it's time to lay it all out. My name's Harper, and my family. Let's just say we could give those dysfunctional TV families a run for their money. It all started when I was 12. My mom had passed away from cancer 2 years earlier, and it was just me and Dad trying to figure out how to keep going. We weren't perfect, but we were close, you know? Like, he'd come to all my school plays, and we'd eat pizza on the couch while watching old action movies. It felt like we had our own little bubble. Then came Denise. Dad met her through some mutual friends, and before I knew it, they were talking about getting married. I don't even think I'd fully wrapped my head around losing Mom, and suddenly I was supposed to be gaining a new stepmom. Denise wasn't terrible or anything. Not at first anyway. She was polite. Maybe even too polite. Like she was trying really hard to impress me. But there was this stiffness to her. Like she was more interested in how we looked as a blended family than how we actually felt. Denise had a daughter, Sloane, who was 2 years older than me. Sloane was a lot. When we first met, she gave me this tight smile and said, "So, I guess you're my little sister now." In this way, that didn't feel warm at all. She had this confidence, like she thought she was the main character in every room she walked in. And me? I was 12. Awkward. Still figuring out how to live in a world without my mom. I tried to be friendly, though, because what else was I supposed to do? We were going to live together. From day one, Sloane made it clear she wasn't interested in being friends, let alone sisters. At first, it was just little things, like ignoring me when I tried to talk to her, or rolling her eyes when I said something. But as time went on, she got bolder. One time, she walked into my room without knocking, looked around and said, "This is a nice setup. Too bad it won't last. My mom says we might need this room for something else." Another time, I heard her tell one of her friends over the phone, "Harper's so lucky. She doesn't even have to try, and Lucas treats her like a princess. Must be nice to get handed everything." I didn't even know what she was talking about. I got good grades, kept to myself, and tried to stay out of trouble. But Sloane always seemed to find a reason to make me feel like I didn't belong in my own. I tried talking to Dad about it a couple of times. I'd say things like, "Sloane doesn't like me and she's mean when you're not around." But Dad didn't get it. He'd sigh and say, "Harper, she's just adjusting. It's hard for her too. Give it time." Denise wasn't any help either. She'd always smile and say, "Teenage girls can be tricky, can't they?" Like Sloane and I were just two cats hissing at each other for no reason. Eventually, I gave up trying to explain. I figured if no one was going to take me seriously, I might as well deal with it on my own. So, I buried myself in school and focused on the things I could control. I got good grades and stayed out of Sloane's way as much as possible. I thought maybe if I just ignored her, she'd get bored and leave me alone. By the time we were teenagers, Sloane had perfected the art of being two-faced. Around our parents, she was all smiles and, "Oh, Lucas, let me help you with that." But when it was just the two of us, she'd make these little digs that made me feel about 2 inches tall. If I got a compliment from Dad, she'd find a way to one-up me. If I did something cool, she'd downplay it. It was like she needed to remind me that she was in charge, even if it didn't make sense. I went off to college when I was 18, and honestly, it was a relief. I loved Dad, but being in that house with Sloane and Denise had started to feel suffocating. I finally had space to breathe and be my own person. I graduated, got a decent job as a project coordinator, and started building my own life that I was proud of. Sloane, on the other hand, was still bouncing between failed business ideas and part-time jobs. Every time something didn't work out, she'd come running to Dad, and he'd always help her. "Need money for a new car? Dad's got you. Credit card debt piling up? Don't worry, Dad will cover it." It annoyed me, but I kept my mouth shut because honestly, what was the point? Dad wanted to help her, and it wasn't my place to tell him otherwise. Then, 3 years ago, everything changed. It started with little things. Dad seemed tired all the time, but he'd shrug it off and say, "I'm just getting older, Harper. Don't worry about me." But it was hard not to notice. He'd lose weight without trying, and there were days when he looked pale, like he was carrying this invisible weight on his shoulders. I started coming over more often, offering to run errands or cook meals, just to make sure he was okay. One afternoon, I was over at the house, and I noticed Dad kept rubbing his hands together, like he was trying to shake off a cramp. I asked him if he was all right, and he gave me this tired smile and said, "Yeah, just a little stiff today." But something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. A couple of weeks later, I got a call from him while I was at work. His voice sounded shaky, and he said, "Harper, I need to tell you something. Can you come over?" I dropped everything and drove straight to the house, my mind racing the whole way there. When I walked in, he was sitting at the kitchen table with Denise, who looked more serious than I'd ever seen her. "I went to the doctor," Dad said, his voice quiet but steady. "They ran some tests and it's leukemia." I froze. I didn't even know what to say. I just sat there trying to process what he'd just told me. Leukemia. The word hung in the air like it didn't belong in our house, like it was some kind of mistake. But it wasn't. It was real. And that's how everything started to unravel. I thought I knew what hard times looked like, but this was a whole new level. Suddenly, all those little family tensions seemed so small. Dad's health became the only thing that mattered. I threw myself into being there for him, driving him to appointments, sitting with him through endless rounds of chemo, and trying to keep the house running. It wasn't easy, but I told myself it was worth it. I wanted to make sure he felt supported. Sloane's reaction caught me off guard. I expected her to either back off entirely, she was never great at dealing with real responsibility, or swoop in just enough to say she tried. But she started showing up more than ever. At first, I thought maybe she was stepping up, finally trying to be there for Dad. But it didn't take long for me to notice that her presence wasn't exactly helpful. Whenever I was with Dad, Sloane would find a way to interrupt. She'd shoo me out of the room. "Dad and I need some time to talk." At first, I let it slide because I figured, it's her stepdad too. Maybe this is her way of coping. But there was something about it that felt calculated. She started getting more involved in his affairs too. She'd casually bring up his finances during conversation, asking him if he needed help managing bills, or offering to take a look at his accounts. Denise was all for it, of course. "Sloane's got such a good head for this kind of thing," she'd say. Like Sloane had a financial degree instead of a track record of bad credit and failed ventures. I didn't love it, but I figured Dad wouldn't hand over control without thinking it through. One night, I stayed late at the house after putting Dad to bed. I'd been sorting through his mail, insurance documents, medical bills, that sort of thing, and I noticed that a couple of things were missing. Nothing major, just small things, like statements I knew he should have gotten. When I asked Sloane about it, she just shrugged and said, "Oh, I probably grabbed those by mistake. I'll bring them back tomorrow." The way she said it was so casual, but something about it didn't sit right. It wasn't just that one thing either. Over the next couple of weeks, I noticed more oddities. A bill would show up already marked paid, even though I knew Dad hadn't handled it. An envelope addressed to Dad would end up in Sloane's bag, and when I'd ask, she'd wave it off like it was no big deal. Then there was the laptop. My laptop. I'd been using it to track some of Dad's appointments and organize paperwork while I stayed at the house. One day, I went to grab it from the desk in the guest room, and it was just gone. I searched everywhere. Under the bed, in the closet, even in the kitchen cabinets. It wasn't like I'd taken it anywhere. I asked Sloane if she'd seen it, and she gave me this smug little smile and said, "Why would I know where your stuff is?" At the time, I figured maybe I'd misplaced it, or maybe it had accidentally gotten packed up in some of Dad's stuff. But deep down, I had this nagging feeling that it wasn't an accident at all. I tried to let it go because I didn't want to stir up more drama. I had bigger things to focus on. Dad's treatments, making sure the house stayed in order, and keeping him comfortable. The last thing I wanted was to add more stress to his life. A few days later, Dad asked me to come to his room. He looked worse than I'd ever seen him, completely drained, and the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. Denise was standing by the door, arms crossed like she was ready to call security, and Sloane was sitting next to Dad on the bed, holding his hand like she'd been there for him all along. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew it wasn't good. "Harper," Dad said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sloane showed me something and I need you to explain it." My stomach sank. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Sloane reached over to the bedside table and grabbed my laptop. The laptop I'd been searching for all week, and flipped it open. She turned the screen toward me, and there it was. Bank statements showing money being transferred out of Dad's accounts into some offshore account under my name. I froze. It was obviously fake, but it looked real enough to make me feel like I was losing my mind. "What is this?" I blurted, my voice shaking. "This isn't real. I've never seen these before." Sloane sniffled dramatically, wiping at non-existent tears. "I didn't want to say anything, Harper," she said, her voice quivering just enough to sell the act. "But I couldn't keep this from Dad. He deserves to know the truth." Before I could even respond, Denise jumped in, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "How could you do this, Harper? After everything your father has done for you? You've been stealing from him while he's sick? You're disgusting." "No, that's not what happened," I shot back, my voice rising as I looked at Dad. "You know me, Dad. I would never do this. This is all fake. Sloane's lying. She's setting me up." "Oh, give it a rest," Denise snapped, rolling her eyes. "You got caught, Harper. Just own it. You've put him through enough already." "Dad, please," I begged, ignoring Denise. "You've known me my whole life. I would never hurt you like this. You have to believe me. But Dad didn't even look at me. I've already made arrangements, he said quietly, staring at the blanket instead of me. I'm changing my will. I can't leave my affairs in your hands if this is what you've been doing. I couldn't even process what I was hearing. He was really doing this? He was taking Sloane's word over mine? I tried to say something, but my throat felt tight, like all the words had dried up. Sloane just sat there, still clutching his hand, her fake innocence so perfect it made my skin crawl. You need to leave, Denise said sharply, stepping closer and pointing toward the door. Your father doesn't need the stress, not from someone like you. I looked at Dad, hoping he'd stop her, that he'd say something, anything, to show he was still on my side. But he didn't. He just stared at the wall, like I wasn't even there. I turned and left the room, my head spinning and my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. As I reached the hallway, Sloane followed me out. The second the door shut behind us, she dropped the act completely. She smirked, leaning in close, and whispered, You should have seen his face when I showed him those statements. Perfect, wasn't it? You never stood a chance. I wanted to scream, to grab her hair and beat her up, letting the truth out of her. But I knew it wouldn't help. If I lost it now, I'd look even guiltier. So I kept walking, my fists clenched so tightly my nails dug into my palms, trying not to let her see how badly she'd won. After that day at the hospital, everything spiraled fast. I didn't go back. Not because I didn't want to see Dad. I wanted to more than anything, but because I knew I wasn't welcome. The way Denise had looked at me, like I was dirt under her shoe, and Sloane's smug little whisper in the hallway. Yeah, I wasn't about to walk back into that war zone. At first, I tried to stay hopeful. I figured Dad might come around, you know. Maybe he'd realize something didn't add up. I kept waiting for a call, some sign that he'd changed his mind or wanted to talk, but that call never came. Instead, I just got updates through mutual friends. People saying things like, Oh, Sloane's been spending so much time with Lucas. She's such a good daughter. Good daughter, my ass. A week later, a lawyer called to inform me that Dad had officially updated his will. I mean, I already knew it was coming, but hearing it spelled out like that hit me like a brick. Everything, his house, his savings, his business shares, worth well over $1 million, was now going to Sloane and Denise. I wasn't just disinherited. I was erased. I didn't know what to do with that information. Part of me wanted to fight it. But how? What proof did I have that Sloane was lying? None. She'd covered her tracks too well. And honestly, even if I could prove something, what was I going to do? Drag my dying father into court? That wasn't going to happen. Unfortunately, Dad's health declined quickly after that. I heard from a mutual friend that he'd been moved to hospice care. I didn't even know. No one told me. When he passed away, I found out through Facebook. Someone posted a rest in peace message, and that's how I learned my dad was gone. I don't think I've ever felt so angry and heartbroken at the same time. I wasn't even given the chance to say goodbye. Sloane and Denise took that from me, just like they'd taken everything else. The funeral was just as bad as you'd imagine. I debated not going, but in the end, I couldn't stay away. It was my dad, and I needed to be there, even if no one wanted me to be. When I showed up, I tried to keep a low profile, sitting in the back row, but it didn't matter. The second Denise saw me, she gave me this icy glare, like I'd crashed her private event. Sloane, of course, played the grieving daughter perfectly. She was front and center, crying into a tissue and accepting hugs from everyone. I stayed quiet, biting my tongue and holding back tears. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life. After the service, I tried to approach the casket, just to have a moment alone to say goodbye. But Sloane cut me off. She stepped in front of me, blocking my path, and said, This isn't the time, Harper. You've done enough. Done enough? I wanted to scream, but instead I turned around and left. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down. The days after the funeral were a blur. I went back to my apartment, this tiny one-bedroom I'd been renting since I moved out of Dad's house. It felt more like a hiding spot than a home, but it was all I had. I barely left. Work was the only thing keeping me sane, and even that was hard to focus. My coworkers could tell something was off, but I just kept saying I was fine. On the other side, Denise and Sloane wasted no time enjoying their newfound wealth. While they hadn't gained access to all of his accounts yet, they seemed to find ways to fund their lavish lifestyle. Sloane upgraded her car to a brand new luxury SUV and started flaunting expensive vacations on social media. Denise, meanwhile, hosted elaborate dinners and bought jewelry that clearly hadn't come from her personal savings. They acted like they'd already hit the jackpot, even as the full estate transfer was still in progress. Meanwhile, I was left trying to rebuild my life, completely shut out of what should have been mine. But one night, I was trying to make sense of everything. That's when I remembered something Dad had told me years ago. He'd been talking about planning for the unexpected, and he'd said something like, That's why I keep a safety deposit box at the bank, just in case. At the time, it hadn't seemed like a big deal, but now it felt like a lifeline. I didn't know what was in the box, or if it would even help, but I had to find out. The next morning, I called the bank. I explained the situation as best I could without sounding completely desperate. I wasn't sure if I'd even still have access to the box, but the person on the phone told me I was listed as an authorized user. That was the first good news I'd had in weeks. When I got to the bank, I asked to speak with someone who could help me access the box. They brought out a manager, a guy who looked like he'd been working there forever. He greeted me politely, but with that no-nonsense kind of vibe, like he wasn't going to waste time. He pulled up the account on his computer and nodded. "Your father mentioned this box to me a few times," he said. "He said it was for emergencies. Let me pull up the records and make sure everything's in order." I sat there, clutching my purse like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. My mind was racing. What if there was nothing useful in the box? What if it was just some old papers or sentimental junk? But even if it was a long shot, I had to know. The manager looked up from his computer. "All right," he said. "The box is still here, and you're listed as an authorized user. Would you like to access it now?" I agreed, and as we approached the vault, my heart was pounding so loudly I thought he might hear it. I had no idea what I was walking into, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had a sliver of control. The manager escorted me to a private room and placed the metal box in front of me. It felt heavier than it should, like it carried more than just documents. Once he left, I stared at it for a moment, then unlocked the latch. Inside, I found a few documents, neatly arranged, and a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Dad's handwriting. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't seen his handwriting since the last birthday card he'd given me. When I opened it, there was a letter inside. It wasn't long, but the words hit me like a punch to the chest. "Harper, if you're reading this, things must not have gone as planned. I've kept this box for years as a safeguard, just in case. There's always been a part of me that worried about Sloane's motives, but I never wanted to believe it. I hope I'm wrong. If I'm not, I trust you to handle this with the same strength and integrity you've always shown. Love, Dad." The letter wasn't proof of anything, but it was enough to make me feel like I wasn't crazy. Dad had seen through Sloane, at least a little. I wasn't alone in thinking something wasn't right. The other documents in the box were old. His will from years ago, insurance papers, nothing that could help now. But the fact that he'd kept this box at all meant he'd known things might go sideways. That thought stuck with me as I left the. A few weeks passed, and I kept turning the situation over in my head. I didn't have much to go on, but I couldn't let it go. Something told me there was more to Sloane's story, and I just had to find it. That's when I got a call I never expected. It was from a guy who introduced himself as a tech contractor. He told me he'd done some freelance work for Sloane, and now he was trying to get in touch with her because she hadn't paid him the full amount she owed. He didn't go into detail at first, but the more we talked, the more I realized he might have the missing piece I'd been looking for. "She hired me to create some fake documents," he admitted eventually. "I didn't ask questions, but now that I know what they were used for, I'm not okay with it. I've got emails, payment records, everything." Turns out Sloane had been sloppy, arrogant enough to think she could hire someone to forge documents and not even pay them properly. And now it was coming back to bite her. The contractor sent me copies of everything, screenshots of their email conversation, invoices, and even drafts of the fake bank statements she'd used to frame me. It was all there, laid out in black and white, my hands shaking as I scrolled through the evidence. I finally had proof, real proof. I went back to the bank and asked to speak to the manager. I showed him everything, the emails, the drafts, all of it. At first, he was hesitant, saying it wasn't the bank's place to get involved in family disputes. But when I explained how Sloane had used those forged documents to manipulate Dad and steal from his accounts, "This is serious," he said. "I'll have to escalate this to our fraud department." He started asking more questions, and I told him everything. How my laptop had gone missing, how Sloane had convinced Dad to change his will, and how I'd been completely cut off from his life in his final weeks. He didn't say much, but I could see the gears turning in his head. A few days later, I got another call from the bank. They'd reviewed the accounts and found irregularities, large transfers from Dad's accounts to an account in Sloane's name, all made in the weeks leading up to his death. The manager said the bank was freezing the account pending further investigation, and that they might need me to provide additional information. It was a small victory, but it felt huge. Sloane's perfect little plan was finally starting to crack. The next time I saw Sloane and Denise was at the bank. They were there to access Dad's accounts, completely unaware that things were already in motion behind the scene. I wasn't supposed to be there, but the bank had called me in to discuss the investigation, and I just happened to arrive at the same time. Sloane's face when she saw me was priceless. She looked nervous. Denise, on the other hand, tried to keep up her usual air of superiority. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice dripping with disdain. "I could ask you the same thing," I replied, keeping my tone as calm as possible. Before things could escalate, the bank manager stepped in. He escorted all of us to a private room, where he explained that they'd found discrepancies in the accounts and needed to investigate further before allowing any more transactions. "What discrepancies?" Sloane asked, her voice a little too sharp. The manager glanced at me before answering. There have been irregular transfers that don't align with the account holder's typical activity. We're working to determine the source. Sloane tried to argue, but her voice faltered. Denise just sat there, her face slowly turning pale as the manager laid everything out. For once, she didn't have anything to say. When Sloane and Denise walked out of that bank meeting, I stayed behind. My head was spinning, but for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like the tide was turning. They'd finally been called out. Their smug confidence had cracked, and I wasn't going to let up now. The next few weeks were a blur of phone calls, emails, and meetings. It was exhausting, honestly. I didn't really understand half of what was happening. It was all lawyers and bank investigations and legal jargon I wasn't prepared for, but I kept showing up, kept providing whatever they asked for. The truth was on my side, and I just had to keep pushing. But the truth didn't make it any easier. Every time I walked into that lawyer's office or sat on hold with the bank for hours, it felt like the system was designed to wear me down. One attorney even told me, "Harper, you need to prepare yourself. Cases like this don't always go the way you hope." I wanted to scream at her. Didn't she understand that this wasn't just some case to me? This was my dad's legacy, my life. Then things shifted. I got a call saying the court had invalidated the will. The fake documents Sloane had used to frame me had been exposed, and that alone was enough to void everything. The estate, the house, the savings, everything was restored to its original terms. It was all mine. I sat there on the couch after that call, trying to process it. I should have felt triumphant, right? Like I'd won? But all I felt was drained. I wasn't happy or relieved. I was just tired. The fallout for Sloane and Denise was massive. The first big blow came when they had to repay the money Sloane had taken from Dad's accounts. The amount wasn't small, and they didn't have the resources to cover it. I heard through mutual friends that they were scrambling to sell off what little they had left. The lawsuit filed by the IT contractor hit Sloane like a wrecking ball. Not only did it expose her for commissioning the fake documents, but it also dragged her name through the legal system in a way she couldn't control. The court ordered her to pay damages to the contractor for unpaid work, and her financial records were subpoenaed as part of the case. That opened a whole new can of worms. It turned out that Sloane had been dipping into other people's accounts too. Smaller sums here and there from friends and even her own mother, Denise. Suddenly, Sloane wasn't just a family scandal. She was the subject of local gossip and a formal fraud investigation. Denise tried to defend her, of course, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. But the evidence was too damning. For the first time, their web of lies wasn't just unraveling, it was collapsing entirely. Sloane had to give up the car she'd bought with Dad's money, and Denise ended up moving out of their fancy rental house. It didn't end there. Their social life? Gone. People who had once bent over backward to praise them started pulling away. The same folks who'd gushed about how selfless as Sloane was when Dad was sick were now whispering about how she'd conned her way into his will. It was brutal, but honestly, I didn't feel bad for them. They'd made their choices. Denise tried to act like she'd had no idea what Sloane was doing, but nobody believed her. She'd been there every step of the way, encouraging Sloane and enabling her behavior. Even if she hadn't forged the documents herself, she was just as guilty in my eyes. The first time I saw Sloane after everything came crashing down, I wasn't expecting it. She showed up at the house, my house now, like nothing had happened. "What are you doing here?" I asked, standing in the doorway with my arms crossed. She looked different, tired, defeated. The confidence that had always been such a big part of her was gone. "I just want to talk," she said quietly. "Please, Harper, we're family." I almost laughed. "Family?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "You've got to be kidding me." She flinched but didn't back down. "I messed up, okay? I made mistakes. I didn't think it would go this far." That hit me harder than I expected. She didn't say she was sorry, didn't even admit what she'd done outright. She just didn't think she'd lose. That was all this had ever been to her, a game. "You've got a funny way of defining mistakes," I said. "You lied. You stole from Dad. You tried to ruin my life. Do you even realize what you've done?" Sloane's face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might actually cry. "I didn't know what else to do," she said. "I thought you'd get everything, and I'd be left with nothing." "You would have had a family," I snapped. "That's what you threw away, Sloane. Not me. You." She didn't say anything else after that. She just turned and walked away. Denise, on the other hand, disappeared almost entirely. After the investigation wrapped up, she stopped showing up to the social events she used to love. I think she realized pretty quickly that she couldn't talk her way out of this one. People had seen the truth now, and there was no spinning it. I heard through the grapevine that she moved in with a friend in a smaller town, probably hoping to start fresh where no one knew her story. As for Sloane, I have no idea where she ended up. I haven't seen or heard from her since she showed up on my porch that day. For me, life slowly started to rebuild itself. The house didn't feel like home right away. It was too full of memories of Dad and too many reminders of the mess Sloane and Denise had left behind. But I took it one day at a time. I kept the letter Dad had left me from the safety deposit box and framed it. It sits on the mantle now, a reminder that he believed in me even when things got messy. I've been slowly turning the house back into a place that feels like mine. The money Sloane took? Most of it was recovered, but it wasn't about the money. It was about knowing that I hadn't been crazy, that I'd fought for the truth, and the truth had come out. That mattered more than any dollar amount. I still think about Dad a lot. I wish he'd been able to see how things played out. Wish he'd been able to see through Sloane's lies sooner. But more than anything, I wish I'd been able to say goodbye. That's the one thing I'll never get back. And it's the part that hurts the most. Sloane and Denise's lives were absolutely ruined. They lost the money, the house, their reputation, everything they'd schemed to take. And me? I'm still standing. I don't know if I'll ever forgive them. Maybe one day, but not now. Some scars take longer to heal than others. For now, I'm just focused on moving forward and making something good out of the mess they left behind.